Hello, everyone joining us. As you join us today, why don't you give us a chance to know where you're from and who's on the webinar with us. So just if you can drop your name in the chat and where you're from, we'd love that to see where everyone's coming from as we get started. Okay. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for IANTA's Community Navigator webinar series. Today's webinar, Creating Project Logic Models, is brought to you in partnership with the U.S. Forest Service. To get us started, I am Hannah Peterson, the Program Development Director here at the American Indian Alaska Native Tourism Association, or IANTA. I am super excited to see Sharon from Minnesota, Crystal from Calgary. Wow, okay, this is great. Um, just to let you know a little bit about IANTA, if you're not familiar, for more than 26 years, the American Indian Alaska Native Tourism Association, or IANTA, has served as the only national organization dedicated to advancing Indigenous tourism in Native nations and communities across the United States. We were established by tribes, for tribes. IANTA is a 501c3 national nonprofit governed by an all-Native board of directors and serves as a united voice for the $11.6 billion Native hospitality sector. IANTA's mission is to define, introduce, grow, and sustain American Indigenous tourism that honors traditions and values. Native nations and communities that are looking to start or expand their recreation and tourism footprint can find resources at www.ianta.org, and visitors interested in learning more about Indigenous tourism in the United States can visit www.nativeamerica.travel, our destination website. Today's webinar is designed to guide you through the process of creating project logic models. This session will break down each component of a logic model, including inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes, and show you how to align your project design with federal funder expectations. Whether you're starting from scratch or refining an existing concept, this webinar will help you clearly communicate your project strategy and value. Our speakers today are from the grant plant. We're so excited to have them back with us. Ali Sanchez is the Director of Strategy and Organizational Development at the grant plant. And we have Laurel Meister-Schmuck. She is the Senior Resource Development Officer at the grant plant. I'll now pass it over to the presenters. If you have any questions, please place them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to them at the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Hannah. I've got a little bit of a delay on the slideshow. As Hannah mentioned, we're from the grant plant, and we're a resource development consultancy in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It's our base of operations. And we are, sorry, let me advance real quick. It is catching up. Okay, we've been around for over 20 years and raised just shy at this point of $400 million for clients, which include nonprofits, organizations, higher education, local governments, state governments, et cetera. And we do prospecting, grant writing, compliance and grant reporting, management support, other sort of case making, and documents around getting resources, that sort of thing. We also have about 40 to 60 clients per year, which include a number of Indigenous-focused charter schools, organizations, a few tribes. And I'm going to say our Native American clients are in New Mexico, California, South Dakota, I think one in Oklahoma, a little bit in Denver, and then a lot that are here in New Mexico and into Dene, into Arizona. So we're going to talk today about logic models. I may have to have Laurel take over the slideshow. Sorry, it's just not advancing for me. And we'll cover what a logic model is, examples and components, how to go about approaching building a logic model, which are oftentimes required in federal proposals, common things that can trip you up, and top tips. And then we'll save some time at the end for resources and question and answer. And I will flip it over to Laurel now for the first section.
Thanks, Sally. All right, so our first section is going to go over the purpose of logic models, how they're structured, their uses in federal grants, and how they're distinct from the results sections and theories of change. So a logic model is a visual diagram of how your project resources and strategies will achieve your desired results. They're typically one page and they're presented in a table or a similar format. And unlike a theory of change, if you're familiar with those, which is typically a more uh, visual and dynamic layout of how you generally believe change will occur across your organization, a logic model is really about program level ingredients, activities, and results. It's time bound. And in the context of federal grants, it's typically limited to the lifespan of your grant period, or it designates short and long-term outcomes. And we're talking about it today because many federal grant proposals require a logic model as a main component of the application and in grant reporting. So at its core, the structure of a logic model is mapping out how your intended strategies will produce your desired results. Now, there are several different components of this, and we'll go over that later in the presentation. But essentially, we see logic models laid out as a table reading from left to right, starting from activities and their inputs or ingredients, and then moving to short and long-term results. So let's go over kind of a simplified example of planning a family vacation. This is taken from the University of Wisconsin Logic Model Guide. So imagine summer vacation time is coming up. We like to camp and we're planning our annual family camping trip. We have existing resources, which include mom and dad, sister and brother, plus our vacation budget, our car, and camping equipment. These are represented by the yellow inputs on the left column. These resources make it possible for us to drive to a state park, set up camp, and engage in a variety of camping activities. These are the activities, and they're represented by the green column in the middle. And then as a result of camping together, we'll benefit in a number of ways. We'll learn more about each other, we'll increase our bond as a family, and we'll have fun. And these are the results represented by the red column on the right. So, as I've said, logic models play a lead role in federal grant proposals and recording. And this slide includes a short list of federal agencies known to require logic models in their applications. This is not an exhaustive list, so definitely check the grant requirements depending on what you're working on. But the logic model is, in fact, often a component that the federal reviewers look at first because it succinctly outlines what you propose to do, how you propose to do it, and the results. And so, in this way, the logic model really can act as a directory that points to the different pieces of your application yet to come, such as the budget, the project plan, evaluation, and results. And really important to note that the logic model also forms the basis of program evaluation and reporting if you do receive an award. So rest assured, it is a key component of the application. Sorry, skipped ahead here. Sorry, having a lag here, 1 sec. There we go. So here's an outline of the many different uses for logic models and functions within federal grants. So kind of at the most basic level, you can use a logic model to help map out and plan your project. And you can really use it as a tool even before you write a federal grant proposal to figure out what it is that your project is doing and what the results of that will be. So it can be a tool to develop programs. Here's what we want. How do we get there? It can be a structural and summative diagram. So here's what we'll do, and here are the dots that connect it. It's a basis for evaluation. It shows what you'll be doing and what you expect to achieve. And then it can also start to show program gaps. So where do the dots not connect? Where do we have a result that we want, but not a way to achieve it? Or we have an activity, but we don't know what the results will be. It should also align with the federal agency priorities. So it's a way to really clearly show how your project kind of aligns with those priorities. And the second column, kind of on the next level, this is a way to demonstrate feasibility and impact. So in our webinar on results, we discussed how well-defined anticipated results can help build trust with federal reviewers. And logic models serve a similar purpose. Many federal agencies require them because they show how your project is feasible and how you'll be accountable through the post-award management process. It shows clear alignment and logic between the different components of your proposal and how it will actually achieve the desired outcomes. And then it's a tool for reviewers to quickly assess your project. And then finally, it shows you, it connects to the budget. So it shows you exactly where the money is going, how that relates to your inputs and activities. Then in the final column here, logic models can really be a tool for post-award program management. We've seen it be a really helpful tool for project teams to help keep everyone on the same page because it's a one-page simple overview to help onboard stakeholders. It provides a really clear roadmap or scope of work. It can also hint at the milestones and measures for reporting, and oftentimes reporting really is built around those logic models. And it defines clearly what success looks like. What are the key results you're working towards? So to summarize, logic models display the theory behind how your strategies will achieve your desired results. They play a lead role in many federal grant proposals and are often reviewed first and can kind of serve as a roadmap for the rest of your application. And they form the basis of federal evaluation and reporting. And back to Allie.
Thank you, Laurel. In this section, we're going to go through some of the elements in a logic model. And apologies for the lags we're experiencing today. So at the top, we can see these are logic model elements that are pretty standard: inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes. We'll discuss these one by one shortly. And on the bottom, we have ones that sometimes appear as expectations or that you might want to include in a logic model. And those might be problems, assumptions, and external factors, maybe objectives embedded into a couple of the things, and impact as a separate item from outcomes. So let's look first at inputs. These are going to be on the leftmost column, typically in a logic model layout. And these are really about what are the ingredients. Think of them as ingredients for the work. Some of them are things that are needed to do, or they're all things that are needed to do the activities and reach the results that are shown in the logic model. Some are probably already in place. That could be things like your facilities or some or all of the staff that you have. You could have existing programs or materials, or outdoor recreation areas, those sorts of things that are coming into the project as contributors but already exist. Some are going to be new inputs, like your grant funding or maybe grant funded personnel, new partnerships, could be those sorts of things. Next up, we have activities. So programming steps, services, and process details that are required in pursuing the goal and achieving the desired result. So here we're getting into the grant term also. So some things might be an input, even if they're new, or might be an activity. So if, say, there's new partnerships, a key question of whether that's an input or an activity is, do you have them in place at the point where you're sort of writing the grant? Like, these people have agreed to be part of this, they're agreed partners, or it's an activity and we're actually going to go out and search for partners, search for partnerships for this. So now we're into the grant term. So for activities, these are what's needed really to reach the results that we're showing in the logic model. So these could be things like, for tourism, maybe developing new experiences or practices, maybe designing and delivering promotional campaigns or outreach campaigns. Could be creating public education materials for folks who are on site at various attractions or natural areas. It could be improving those site facilities themselves or creating new ones, could be holding events, those sorts of things. It can also include capacity development to be able to do what's proposed or doing evaluation, that sort of thing. Next are going to typically be your outputs and outcomes. If you joined us last time, we covered these in a fair amount of depth for that training, and you can view the recording as well as some materials there. As a refresher, though, outputs are products of the effort. If we do these activities, we should expect these things to be produced. So you can often put them on the table or count them as measures of that effort. So it could be, number of events held. It could be campaign materials created for tourism outreach effort. Could be ticket sales for events or guided tours that were held, that sort of thing. Outcomes, on the other hand, are where you get into the sort of did it matter question. So outcomes are measures of the effect, which you have less control over. These really capture changes in thoughts, beliefs, skills, behaviors, attitudes, conditions, experiences, that sort of thing. So this could be learning about, local tribal cultural practices. It could be rating an event highly. It could be increasing the skills of local museum staff in some area based on training or other activities. It could also be like generating revenue for area hospitality businesses, the follow-on effects of tourism to other organizations. Just as a refresher, we have included the same two tools from last time, the results term reference sheet shown here, and the simple results planning bullet list worksheet. Now, I want to note that the bullet list worksheet, if you fill it out and turn it sideways, has a lot of resemblance to a logic model itself. So it's a great starting point. And both of these are really salient both to the results discussion we had last time, as well as to kind of what goes into a logic model. So we had those bubbles that were on the bottom of things that sometimes are in there. Different agencies typically embed these, but those are things like problems. I sometimes just put a statement at the top, kind of capturing that a bit. Because I think it's helpful sometimes, but that could be a few data points or general discussions. It could be transportation is a challenge in rural tribal areas, economic factors, that sort of thing. Pieces that are important to understand. A brief statement sometimes is included. Now, assumptions and external factors typically appear along the bottom of a logic model, especially for research organizations like the National Science Foundation. So these are things that for assumptions you have relied upon for how you think things will work and what would be accomplished. So it could be that, a continued partnership with a local school district will continue. It could be that there will be interest in a class among the folks that it's geared towards or towards a certain experience. It could be that your marketing campaign results are similar to prior efforts. And then the other one, external factors, are sort of outside the envelope of your organization and your project, but they can play a significant role in success. So one of those might be if it's a multi-year grant, that there's continued federal funding or that a partner continues to receive certain federal funding. It could be economic conditions, like going into a recession that can oftentimes change things up. Or pandemics. We ended up writing kind of ongoing pandemic assumptions into logic models for quite a few years. It could also be changes that might happen in regulations, that sort of thing that affect pieces. Those are the things we'd be thinking of for external factors, but it really depends on the funder and the organization. And impact may be included as a distinct thing from outcomes, which I'm not particularly fond of because it's a very funny, fuzzy line. If you joined us last time, you may remember that I defined outcomes as about impact. So when it's included as a separate element, or sometimes it'll be goals instead, usually what it means is that outcomes, they're looking for kind of short-term results, or something really tightly with the directly affected population. And then they're thinking of impact as a bit broader or longer term. So it might be some programming is very specifically about training personnel on something, but then the broader impact is how that then translates to other people interacting with things. So it can be in there, and it can be a little bit tricky to handle. But again, impact is going to be more along the lines usually of the kind of outcome-like things of affected people, places, conditions, that sort of thing. Okay, I'm gonna hand it off to Laurel again for our next section on how these progress in the diagram, typically.
Thanks, Holly. Yeah, so here's a different way of kind of visualizing or thinking about logic models as moving from a problem to a goal or solution. And so as you can see here, each of the different components lead into each other. So if resources are needed to operate your program, you have those resources, then you can use them to accomplish your planned activities. And if you accomplish those activities, then you will hopefully deliver the amount of product and or service that you intended, and so on and so forth. So you can kind of think about your logic model as a series of if-then statements. So next, let's dive into some real examples from federal agencies that may be of interest. Here's an example from the U.S. Department of Agriculture's National Institute of Food and Agriculture, NIFA, and it funds a variety of agricultural research, education, and extension programs. So according to their website, they really think about logic models as serving a few different purposes. It clarifies the linkages between their investments and the actual activities, outputs, or outcomes expected of this various programs or grants that they're funding. Logic models for them also communicate externally about the rationale and activities and expected results of the policy, program, or initiative. It can test whether the policy makes sense from a logical perspective and provide a fundamental framework on which the performance measure and evaluation strategies are based. So what does success look like, and what does that mean for grantees? So zooming in here, and I know it's pretty small, but I have the main points outlined here. Kind of looking at the strategy side of things, the model begins with assumptions. So this is one of those kind of extra components that Ali was discussing, and it's a premise supporting the relationship between elements. So in their example, they include a strong evidence basis for the relationship between the elements as kind of a core assumption behind the logic model. And then it progresses to the situation, describing the challenges or opportunities, such as globalization's impact on farmers or the obesity crisis. And then into inputs, what is invested, such as faculty, funds, and time. And you can see in this logic model, there are quite a few different kind of types of components or challenges that they're trying to address. Presumably the different grant programs might focus in on each of those. On the results side of things, we get activities. Oh, sorry. Activities are on the last slide. Yeah, so activities here, research and publications, education, counseling, resource development, and then this description of participants reached, they included in the activities. I've also seen that broken out separately. Okay, so now progressing to results. you have external factors. So this is where Allie was saying things like the pandemic could be here. Here they include variables such as weather because they are working on farming programs. And then outputs would be things like scientific publications, patents, new technologies, policy recommendations, resources that they'll develop, and participants reached. And then outcomes, they separate into 3 different categories. And I think this is actually a really helpful way to think about outcomes. So first they have knowledge outcomes, and these are different changes in what participants learn, such as new fundamental knowledge or improved skills. Then they have action outcomes, which are changes in behavior, such as applying new skills or adopting new technology. And then they have conditioned outcomes. So these are societal improvements resulting from their actions, such as increased market opportunities, better animal health, or higher water quality. Here's another example from the US Department of Commerce's Economic Development Administration, which funds efforts to promote innovation and competitiveness to prepare America's regions for economic growth. EDA uses an overarching logic model to gather and report program outputs and capacity outcomes data from grantees. So you'll see the categories here are kind of similar from the last example. You'll notice that outputs and activities are used interchangeably here. So they're kind of combining those two in this logic model. And this is why it's so important to look at the particular agency's guidance on how they're thinking about logic models. And zooming in on the outcomes or results section here, they also have 2 different types of outcomes that they're looking at, which is pretty unique to this model. So capacity outcomes are the direct shorter term outcomes that occur as a result of the program to enhance the capabilities of the grantees themselves or the program's client or participants. So these capacity outcome categories are things like production processes and business capacities, markets and business networks, innovation, tech transfer, financing and investment, and so forth. And then in contrast are the realized outcomes. So these are longer term impacts of the program, including at a regional level. So these may include things like measurable growth in terms of jobs or other quantifiable economic factors. In this unique example, some US Department of Education grants require use of a third-party software to create a logic model. And note that in this case, there's not a whole lot of room for detail, but the relationship between the different components seems to be what's important to them. So you can see that as indicated by the colored arrows. And this is kind of just in there as an example that there are many different ways to approach a logic model, and you really need to look at the different federal guidance to see. Sometimes they even have a specific software they want you to use. In this case as well, there's a short-term, midterm, and long-term outcome section. Here's an example of a more visual logic model from NEA focused on creative placemaking. There are different areas of project activities by theme. They've kind of coded these using these little icons. The results are also notably divided by geographic scope. So they have kind of a larger innovation and systems change, and then they have a more community level change. So unique way to approach a logic model as well here. So some key takeaways from this section. Typical logical model components include inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes, though those definitions can kind of vary based on the different federal agencies. As we've seen, outcomes can be broken down in many different ways. And then there's also other components that can sometimes be added, such as situation appraisal or assumptions. You always want to refer to the federal agency definitions and requirements. There's a lot of variety in the way that federal agencies treat logic models, components, format, and then the level of detail they're looking for. Back to you, Allie.
Thanks, Laurel. Now we're going to explore creating logic models. As Laurel mentioned too, it's great to actually look at these before you're working on a grant. They're a great way to sort of think through and design, especially new or expanded programming. But in the real world, we often find that it is sort of the deadline-driven and required grant component. So whether you're updating a logic model you've already created for a specific grant or creating one just for one, we're going to focus on that grant context and especially on sort of the federal context as we have been. Now, we'll talk a bit about exploring the specific grant expectations, typical processes, or how you might think about developing these, federal considerations, how to check your logic, and the relationship to evaluation. So, as we probably all know, federal grant making, federal grants, federal calls for proposals are kind of complex. So diving in, we want to make sure we are tapping the knowledge available from the funder about the particular grant. So some federal agencies are pretty loose about logic model requirements. They don't offer that much guidance, while others offer a fair amount or a template, that sort of thing. And some are pretty tightly prescribed things. Laurel showed that example of the software requirements. That's going to really heavily affect exactly how you do things. So where do we look and what do we look for? First, we want to look at the grant-specific instructions or guidance. So that can be called an RFP, RFA, NOFA, NOFO, whichever label they use, the instruction packet that is specific to that particular grant cycle and that particular grant. And within those, we want to be taking a look at, what is it that if they require a logic model, what are the specific requirements? And within the review criteria, is there stuff that's specifically said about the logic model? Or other things that are relevant that might be about results or approach, those sorts of things that really speak to or have the logic model as a consideration. Also, is it a separate attachment or embedded within the page limit of your narrative, that sort of thing. And I saw a question in the Q&A about should we attach one if it's not required? I think it can be really helpful. That gives you a little bit more room to roam. But then you might be making a decision of should we embed this into the narrative or as an attachment if optional attachments are allowed. So we also want to take a look at things, in terms of are there restrictions? If there's required evaluation, that should probably appear in there. What are the purposes of the grant? What are the allowable and unallowable activities? Those sorts of things that are going to affect most likely what we put in that logic model. We also want to check for other guidance. So there may be agency level or office level application guides. NSF is an example of that, where there's additional detail on formatting requirements, additional detail on typical components that's in a whole separate guide that is across all of their grant programs. There may be supportive technical assistance pieces or examples that are included of logic models or webinars that dive a little bit into the creation of the logic models. You don't have to have a mastery of all of these things, but we want to make sure that we're checking and gathering that information before we really start to dig into developing those. And then we want to be referring to it as we go through and develop the logic model. But it's great to know kind of what needs to be in here, how it's getting scored, what the instructions are, so that we won't have to revise work as we go through. And one other tip too is sometimes good guidance on logic models is not part of the announcement or page from a federal agency about a particular grant. Sometimes you have to go up and search a little bit more upstream. So we looked at, I think, a NEFA one. Sometimes the NEFA resources for creating logic models are on the web page for that particular grant. But if not, you can search for them or find those resources otherwise. So sometimes a little bit of hunting helps. Okay, so there's a number of process guidelines, even third-party like logic model generator tools for creating these. There's some basics for a solid approach. first make sure that you have the right people in the room. It helps to develop it together. I like using a big whiteboard. If you're developing it or having somebody draft it on their own, then make sure you have the right people providing feedback, thinking through it, maybe even spawning out questions before you've drafted something to kind of gather input on things. Also, just understanding first the results you want to achieve. So if we don't have a destination, it's hard to know what to include in the journey. So starting with either outcomes or goals, but something really on that right-hand side, even if they're just little placeholder bullets that you're going to refine later, that's going to help you build out the center part of your logic model. So the other piece we want to think about too is, naming the activities to generate the outcome. The level of detail here will sort of depend on what the expectations are around that logic model. It may make sense to have things in sort of broad areas of work or divided by strategy, or it may make sense to really be listing activities at a pretty detailed level to capture everything individually too. And then looking, when we think about those activities, what are the outputs that are going to be produced? What will be naturally generated from that, or that we could show a funder? So, it could be survey results, not necessarily that you did well, but you're doing a survey. So there's survey results, for example. It could be that we're creating materials for a new tour of a certain area, those sorts of things. So as you go through, you kind of build from the edges internally, usually. And then really thinking about, do we have all the ingredients here? Are the inputs everything we will need, whether it's new or to be part of the proposed work? Do the activities capture everything that we need to get to that goal? Are the results realistic? So when there's not specific materials presented by a federal agency or an example or a template, like I said, I'll usually do some searches within the agency website, or even just sort of web browser Google searches for maybe other people's submissions or examples of what they've submitted as logic models for that grant, for that office. So that's going to give me a sense of detail level, of structure, those sorts of things. The questions I'm asking myself usually, if there's not specific guidance, is, is there kind of a standard layout, or those which boxes, which columns are included? Are some of those extra items like external factors expected for these, even if it's not instructed? Does the funder expect those connector arrows? That makes it a lot fussier, a lot trickier, allows some extra time. Another biggie, though, is just the detail level and text density. So Laurel showed a few examples, some of which were much more dense, and I'm going to guess down at probably an Arial narrow 9-point type. Other funders want to see something that is more broad and easier to read. So density of text is a biggie that I look for, or detail level in general. Also, does it seem to be expected that there are going to be specific numeric targets in those outputs and outcomes? Am I seeing people put, we will hold 12 listening circles with community members? Or is it just listening circle with community members as an output? Do the outcomes have something like 80% of people will rate their experience at our cultural center at a 4 out of 5 or higher? Are there kind of these embedded objectives in there? So those are the sorts of things I look at. Also with federal, we want to make sure that we mirror the guidance, definitions of things, as well as the overall purpose and priorities. Those are generally in the first few pages of an RFP. They start off usually with what the legislated purpose, and then often present any priority areas pretty quickly. We want to be clear on expectations around evaluation and data collection, since evaluation is an activity on its own, oftentimes, especially if they want an evaluation plan or a third-party evaluator, that becomes its own activity usually. But also that idea of, if we put it in a logic model, generally that's going to be the basis for what we're measuring and reporting on. We want to make sure to cross-check it with other elements. For example, are the inputs that we don't have already aligning with our budget? Are the things in the budget that aren't appearing in our inputs in the logic model? Looking at staffing, other partner sections. And again, are we being realistic what can be accomplished in that time frame? Now, a couple of tips for both development and for checking your draft logic model. Oftentimes it's easiest to take what I call a bookend approach, which is to really start with those outcomes and then maybe the inputs and activities, and then fill in the middle, connect the dots from right to left. And that can be really helpful to take as a general approach. Understanding outputs versus outcomes as well. What is a product of the effort versus an effect of whether it did what you thought it would do. Results-based accountability is a planning and measurement framework that has some good questions that can help here, which is how much did we do, which is an output, how well did we do it, which is a process measure, which is still usually within the output side, and is anyone better off? And that's where we're getting into the outcomes. Another tip is kind of a column shuffle, is review your bullets against the element definitions. And then also just go through down, are all of these things that I put in the outcome column actually outcomes and worded as outcomes? And same with outputs. Oftentimes a little bit different wording can change something that's a bit of a gray area. Or something may have a characteristics of both. If it's like getting people to attend something, if it's not a big strain to do that, it's probably that attendance is an output. If getting that engagement or ongoing engagement really is an effect of how well you're structuring things and listening to those folks, then that may be an outcome. Okay, so other pieces we might want to look at is to dive in a little bit deeper on that evaluation idea. This is especially important in federal grants because of the place and the use of logic models. So there may or may not be a requirement for third-party evaluator or an evaluation plan as distinct from just like results measurement and data collection. So when we want to think about that, that, like I said, is oftentimes now its own distinct activity. There's an input often of an evaluator. There might be other inputs related to evaluation, like stipends for participants, those sorts of things. And then we also want to look at, especially in the outputs and then outcomes, at least the short term, if it's breaking it in time into short term and long term. Short term is generally going to be within the time period of the grant itself. So are we confident that we can measure this? Do we understand how we would measure it? Looking at data collection, those sorts of things, because that's generally what our reporting will be based on or will be expected to report on within performance reporting with a federal grant. So always be prepared to actually report on that and that it's feasible to do so. We talked a lot about that last session. So just again, make sure it's a realistic thing to be able to collect and that the goals themselves, the results you're looking at are. Okay, so we want to, of course, check it across, and this is something to do sort of while developing, and then towards the end as part of your final, quality control. Did the numbers match what you have for service levels or activity levels in your narrative? That budget, is that mirroring what our inputs are and our activities? Or are there things missing from one or the other that don't quite jive? Results, are those matching maybe where we have objectives in our narrative, which could be either an output or an outcome? Is that working? Is the hierarchy similar? And again, just making sure we're showing those ingredients in there. We might be clustering things too by project phases. Sometimes we're required to do a data management plan too. So looking at those pieces and making sure everything is connected and matches other areas where the same information is presented in a different way. Okay, so the new resource that we're providing you since last time is our own logic model toolkit, which includes a lot of links, some example logic model templates in Word format. PowerPoint's also common for creating these. And you'll see common examples, including this one shown in color, which is a beast to work with because it's really hard to format within. So if you're required a special format, also expect to spend certain time on it. Connector arrows, stuff like this is highly formatted, makes it a little bit tricky. But we have a few of those templates that you can use, plug and play, as well as a lot of linked resources in our own logic model toolkit. Okay, takeaways. So again, the importance of the grant guidance, both the instructions for that particular release, as well as all of the other kind of agency resources that might be there. And what people have done in the past is oftentimes a really good guide of like, okay, this has worked for funded projects. So this seems to be the type of thing that reviewers look for. Again, scan for consistency across and within your columns and the proposal elements. Also think about it as a tool that can kind of stand alone and be understandable that way. And then again, the importance of logic models as the basis for both federal evaluation and for your later reporting. And I will hand it back to Laurel.
Thanks, Sally. So now we'll go over common trip ups and top tips. So here's some things that you should do when you're creating logic models. Kind of as Ali went through, it's helpful to check your logic threads from left to right and right to left. Make sure everything matches up. All the inputs have activities, feed into activities, and the activities achieve the planned outcomes, and they'll result in the overall goal or desired impact. There should be a clear causal chain with no leaps in logic. As we've said, you can use logic models to support program design, not just because they're required in a grant, but really to help you think through your program and its results. You'll want to check agency guidance for examples and expectations, as Ali mentioned. And then in the actual creation of the logic model, we've found that PowerPoint or Word tables tend to be kind of the easiest to format. I've also been known to make them in Excel, which is always a little bit trickier. Both Ali and I like to often start with a written version. So Ali likes to use a whiteboard. I like to use good old pencil and paper just to kind of get ideas onto a page before fiddling with all of the formatting and things like that. Because you can get kind of distracted by that. Make sure that your elements are specific and that you're reviewing for exactly where that item should be placed. So is it an action or is it more of an outcome or output? Ensure that it matches with other elements of your proposal. One trick we like to do is just to highlight things that are specific details to cross-check. So these might be numbers that you need to make sure follow through in the rest of the application, more specific details to mention. And then kind of just in the background of creating the logic model, keep in mind that sometimes federal grants take a while to actually be reviewed, processed, awarded. And so by the time that you are ready to implement the grant, the logic model kind of needs to stand on its own, or you need to have the background documentation or ideas about who is actually doing these things. So keep in mind that it should be kind of an evergreen document in terms of being able to kind of direct the actual project management staff. The don'ts: don't wait until an application opens. You can start now developing your logic model. Don't fiddle with your formatting or get fancy right away. It's easier to kind of just get ideas down first. Don't confuse the various components. You really want to be precise and make sure you're using the funder's definitions. You don't want to be too vague or too ambitious. You really want to make sure that your logic model is feasible and that you know how you're going to implement it. And then kind of as Ali mentioned, the certain level of detail in your logic model really depends on the way that funder is thinking about the logic model. So you'll want to take their lead. It shouldn't be too detailed. Alrighty, so here are some additional resources. Listed here are the 3 different tools that Ali went over, and then we have some links to some other resources that may be helpful for you, just third-party guides. Some of these are federal guides as well. And you can scan the QR code to stay up to date on what the grant plant's working on, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion.
Thank you so much for this thorough dive into logic models. One of the things that I hope you can also expand on is the logic model, right, is part of a bigger application process or RFP NOFO process. So can you talk a little bit about how the logic model ties to the budget?
I can start and then Ali can jump in. So I think that really the input section is likely where you're going to see, well, that's not true. The budget, the federal grant will always be listed as an input, but then moving into the activities, you really want each of those activities to be reflected in the budget or otherwise accounted for as to how you're going to actually accomplish each of those things. So let's say you're going to do like a training, you probably will see training materials or travel to the training sites reflected in the budget. And so it can be a really helpful way to just kind of list everything that and then go through it and see what might carry over to the budget. Ali, do you have other thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think it's also helpful in terms of what we think about of, is this a ready input versus is this part of an activity that is funded to be accomplished? Sometimes those are a little bit gray. So besides the budget, we may see inputs that are more leveraged resources, which may have its own section in the narrative too. But yeah, I think if we look at those costs, are we making sure that, at the input level, they might not be bullet listed one by one, like a line item budget or something. But if it's, resources to accomplish outreach or evaluation or something, that we have it reflected in one way or another. And then the activities is the other big area that we would see that. Our volumes, though, are oftentimes going to be in the budget narrative. It might be something like hold, 12 tours of the Valles Caldera National Park. And we don't want there to be 10 shown in the budget. So that's, again, also one of those areas besides in the development side in that quality control to make sure, oh yeah, we thought we were going to do 12, but we had to reduce it to 10 just because we couldn't make the budget stretch. So things can be in alignment at one point and then knock out of alignment. But the other thing that's great is the other direction for budget planning of making sure, if you've been looking at the logic model and saying, is there stuff in here that we see that actually is going to have a cost that we haven't thought about in the budget? Are we missing pieces? And does that mean we can do it, or that it's a leveraged resource that we feel pretty secure, or part of our match, maybe, if we're required to do match? So it goes both ways with a logic model in terms of the relationship with the budget.
I think another quick thing is we talk a lot about budgets being right sized for the program. And so the logic model can kind of help with that scoping. So depending on the size of the federal budget you're working with, you may be able to serve more or fewer people. And so kind of that relationship between the logic model and the budget needs to be right in terms of the size and the amount of funding requested.
How do you feel about kind of, if all these things fall in place, we'll be able to do kind of the phase 2 of things? How do you feel about putting that sort of aspiration in the logic model?
Well, depending on the setup of the logic model, there's sometimes kind of short-term, mid-term, and long-term outcomes. So that can be a way to address that kind of the future opportunities. Ali, do you have other thoughts on that?
Yeah, so every once in a while there'll be, like, if it's a sequenced federal program where there's maybe a planning grant, an implementation grant, a scale grant, or something like that, it may, sort of distinctly appear in, something like the activities of gathering, in year 3, the team will get together to prepare or discuss a phase 2 application. So sometimes it's really discreetly in there, but typically that's going to be part of what we think about in terms of those oftentimes time divided outcomes. Like Laurel was saying, of short term are typically within a grant year or the term of a grant for multi-year. And that can change. That's important to get a handle on of exactly what time periods they may be talking about or expecting. But teeing up capacity development. So for outcomes, we may have something that is, whether or not it's that funding or next thing of our organization is poised to implement or to scale, has the knowledge or budget development for the next phase. So you can have outcomes, activities, and outputs that are related to preparedness for a next phase. So absolutely that can be embedded. So we'll see it in a few different ways if we're really thinking forward beyond the grant term too.
Well, thank you very much for giving that bigger, broader perspective. Well, you've been so gracious with your time. Should we move on to the next slide and we'll close out the grant or the grant logic model webinar, sorry. Okay, so I did want to let everyone know about future webinars in this series. Please be sure to check out our website for access to both past webinars, including this one will be up shortly, and register for upcoming webinars at ianta.org/webinar series. Up next in the Community Navigator series include tourism, recreation, and land use planning to address climate and fire risk mitigation. And that's on September 2nd, 2025. And then on September 16th, we have how to be in compliance with your federal grant requirements. So project narrative reporting, that's that end of the project after, or as you're working through the project, once you've received the grant. Next slide, please. Also wanted to let you know we do have additional training opportunities on our website, including our partnership-based certificate program with Arizona State University. You can scan the slide or visit our website for more information regarding the certificate program, upcoming webinars, past webinars, resources, and upcoming events at ianta.org. Please also consider signing up for our weekly newsletter, the Rupert Report, to keep up with all things Indigenous tourism. For more information, please see our website again at ianta.org. Next slide, please. We also have lots and lots of resources, information, and opportunities on our website. I'm just going to highlight here nativeamerica.travel. I spoke about it in the beginning. That is our destination website. It is the only consumer-facing destination website dedicated to Indigenous tourism. So please take a look at it and please join us on it. Okay, next slide, please. Well, and my favorite event of the year, the American Indigenous Tourism Conference, or AITC. I so want to encourage you to come join us for the 27th Annual American Indigenous Tourism Conference. This year, we will be hosted by the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians at the beautiful Pearl River Resort in Choctaw, Mississippi on October 27th through the 30th. Join us as we celebrate resilience, creativity, and collaboration in the ever-evolving world of Indigenous tourism. And for more information, again, please look at our website. There is a tab for AITC. Next slide, please. And we end with gratitude. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for the webinar today. And thank you to our guests. Allie and Laurel, you were fantastic. It's been great partnering with you for this series. So enjoy learning more about the work you do at the grant plan and then also these deep dives into federal grant processes. And then also wanted to a huge thank you to the U.S. Forest Service for supporting IANTA's Community Navigator program. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you at the next webinar.